Hello, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation about my recent trip to the West Bank to take part in olive harvesting. Jeremy Bowen, who is the international editor for the BBC, said that the first time correspondents visit Israel and Palestine, they return home saying that they're going to write a book about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On their second trip to the Holy Land, they return home saying that they're going to write an article about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And by the time their third trip to the Holy Land comes round, they return home saying, what on earth do we know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I mention this by way of introduction, just to explain that the political situation in Israel and Palestine is very complex and difficult to understand. And so in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing what my reflections are on what is happening there in Israel and Palestine, and what I have seen and what I have heard from my time over there, recognizing that there are people who know Israel and Palestine, the Holy Land, far better than I do, and will have a much greater awareness of the political situation there than I could ever hope to have. In order to understand what is happening in the Holy Land, it's helpful to have some historical background. And it's important to understand Zionism, because Zionism is hugely important in Israel today. Zionism arose in the late 19th century in reaction to anti-Semitism in Europe. In 1896, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish journalist living in Austria-Hungary, published the foundational text for political Zionism, Der Judestaat, which is translated as the Jewish state or the state of the Jews, in which he asserted that the only solution to the Jewish question in Europe, including the problem of growing anti-Semitism, was the establishment of a state for the Jews. In his book, he concludes, let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil, and die peacefully in our own homes. And Zionism is hugely important today, and that desire for the Jewish people to have their own state where they will be safe remains incredibly powerful. Herzl proposed two possible regions for a settlement or a state for the Jews, Argentina in South America and Palestine. But he recognised that colonisation in either place would be difficult. He wrote, in both countries important experiments in colonisation have been made, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. An infiltration is bound to end badly. It continues to the inevitable moment when the native population feels itself threatened and forces the government to stop a further influx of Jews. Immigration is consequently futile unless we have the sovereign right to continue such immigration. A year later, Herzl founded the Zionist Organization, which at its first Congress called for the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine, secured under public law. Herzl died in 1904, 44 years before the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, announcing its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire with a small Jewish population. There were several reasons for the Balfour Declaration. Firstly, the British Prime Minister Lloyd George believed in the Zionist cause. Secondly, in 1917, World War I was still raging, with no end in sight, and it was hoped that this declaration would gain Jewish support for the Allies in neutral countries, particularly in America and also in Russia, where the anti-Semitic Tsarist government had just been overthrown with the help of Russia's Jewish population. Lloyd George also wanted to see British dominance in Palestine, which was seen as a really important land bridge between the territories of India and Egypt, which were part of the British Empire. The establishment of a Zionist state under British protection was seen as one way of accomplishing this goal. After World War I, Britain was entrusted with the temporary administration of Palestine. But many Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere were outraged by the failure to receive their nationhood and self-government, which they believed they had been promised if they supported the British in the war against Turkey during World War I. In the years after World War I, the Jewish population in Palestine increased dramatically from 80,000 people in 1922 to around 450,000 people in 1939. Around 30% of the population. And the interwar years saw numerous instances of Jewish-Arab violence. We cannot understand the modern state of Israel without understanding the Holocaust and the impact that this has had upon Jewish people. The Holocaust saw up to 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. And following the end of the Second World War, many of the surviving Jews were unwilling or unable to return to their pre-war homes because their homes had been destroyed, but also because anti-Semitism still ran rife. And the doors to other countries such as the United States of America were closed to Jewish refugees. So many Jews from this period onwards sought the right to return to Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations came up with a partition plan, which proposed an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state, with the city of Jerusalem and Bethlehem being an international city. The plan was accepted by the Jewish leadership, but was rejected by Arab leaders. The Jewish leadership in Palestine declared the establishment of the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948, the very same day that the British Mandate ended. The following day after Israel's independence was declared, Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies, marking the start of Israel's War of Independence. The fighting ended in 1949 with the Gaza Strip occupied by Egypt and East Jerusalem and the West Bank occupied by Jordan. The surrounding Arab states refused to recognise Israel. The Palestinians call the day of Israel's declaration of independence the Nakba. Nakba means disaster, catastrophe or cataclysm, and they see the creation of the State of Israel, the Nakba, as the marking of the destruction of Palestinian society and homeland and the permanent displacement of Palestinian Arabs. 750,000 to 1 million Palestinians were expelled from their homes in over 400 Arab towns and villages from 1948 onwards. Many of these locations have been repopulated by Jewish immigrants or turned into parks, with their names replaced with Hebrew names and the villages destroyed so that there is no trace of their Arab inhabitants. The biggest change to Israel's frontiers came in 1967, when the conflict known as the Six-Day War left Israel in occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and most of the Syrian Golan Heights, effectively tripling the size of territory under Israel's control. Israel annexed East Jerusalem, claiming the whole of the city as its capital, along with the Golan Heights. Overwhelmingly, international opinion continues to consider the West Bank, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights as occupied territory. The borders of the 1967 war are very similar to Israel's boundaries today, as this next slide shows. Since 1967, Israel has been steadily annexing and occupying more and more Palestinian land in the West Bank through the construction of Jewish settlements. These settlements, under international law, are considered illegal, and the United Nations has called on Israel to desist from transferring its own population into the territories or changing their demographic makeup. The United Nations considered the establishment of Israeli settlements on occupied land as a violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which says that the occupying power, in this case Israel, shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. But despite this, Israel has continued to build settlements on Palestinian territory in the West Bank, and today there are 270 Israeli settlements in the West Bank, with a population of over 750,000 settlers. The Palestinians describe what is happening today in their former Palestinian territories as the ongoing Nakba, or the ongoing catastrophe. And today it is estimated that there are now 7.1 million Palestinian refugees and displaced persons. Most of these are located in the West Bank and neighbouring Arab countries such as Lebanon, Jordan and Syria. And Palestinians today, several generations on, still describe themselves as refugees because they were forced from the towns and villages in which they were once lived. And these maps that I'm going to show now show how the land once owned and occupied by Palestinians has shrunk over the years. And the reason I went to the West Bank was to help with the olive harvest, which takes place every October. Olive trees are important. They are a symbol of peace. They also symbolise the Palestinian struggle to remain rooted in their lands and homes. Harvesting olives is one of the ways many Palestinian families support themselves, but it is a way of life threatened by settlement expansion, military zoning and intimidation. And I went with the organisation Embrace the Middle East to help take part in the olive harvest. Here we can be seen standing with the group of people outside our hostel, which was near Bethlehem. In the following slides, you can see some of the scenes of olive harvesting. So here I am with the Embrace group, which featured people from different parts of the UK. And here we are harvesting olives in Palestinian territory. On our first day of olive picking, we broke in the middle of the day to celebrate communion in the middle of the olive grove, which was a beautiful location and a very symbolic location in which to celebrate communion. During the 10 days that I was in the West Bank, we were also joined by Palestinian people, including these youngsters who took part in the olive harvest. The one thing that particularly struck me about these young people is that, like young people all around the world, they have the same hopes, dreams and aspirations as all young people have, and are immensely proud of their Palestinian heritage. I was particularly struck by the appearance of this young girl who was wearing a t-shirt with the slogan, "The Real Home of the Brave," and the outline of her t-shirt shows Palestine as it once was. Life for Palestinians can be very difficult indeed, and they face many hardships. This is one of the farms in which we were harvesting olives. The farmer can be seen there in the middle. He was 87 years old, and he was climbing trees with me harvesting olives, which was quite extraordinary. And this is a photo of his son. His son told me how their family had farmed this olive grove for many generations, and yet it was under threat from expansion from illegal Jewish settlements which are built all around the farm and now surround the farm. Settlements are regularly built on high ground. You can see here a settlement in the distance with the family farm on the right. And when Palestinian land is seized, they receive no compensation whatsoever. Settlements start like this, with portable cabins being placed illegally on Palestinian land, and over time these portable cabins are replaced by more permanent structures until a whole town is developed and built on Palestinian land. You can see how that process is happening here in this particular photo. Eventually these settlements grow and develop until they become towns in their own right. The photo here is of one settlement opposite Bethlehem, and you can see how it has spread and expands right across the hillside. Settlers are offered incentives by the Israeli government to move to the West Bank. They're offered lower taxes, cheaper housing and good quality housing. And the settlers can be a mixture of Zionists and Jewish immigrants from other countries. I was told that many of the settlers that have been moving to the West Bank in recent years come from Russia and are actually Russian Orthodox Christians, but are people who may have some Jewish ancestry in their past. But the State of Israel is actively encouraging people with Jewish heritage to move to Israel and move into the occupied territories. The 1950 Law of Return guarantees anyone who is Jewish the right to live in Israel, but a Palestinian refugee is barred from returning and denied residency rights, even if they have family living in the area. Olive harvesting is a way of life that is hugely important to the Palestinians, but Palestinians often face harassment when they're seeking to harvest their olives. One group of olive pickers not far from where we were, at the same time we were there, were attacked by settlers, with one 70-year-old Israeli woman attacked with clubs and stabbed simply because she was helping Palestinian farmers with their olive harvest. Sadly, attacks such as this happen on a frequent basis.
Each October, Palestinians prepare for the annual olive harvest. At least 80,000 families in the West Bank rely on this tradition for their livelihoods, but they face growing hardship. Attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinian property rise significantly during harvest season with impunity. Israeli authorities themselves confiscate agricultural land, enforce access restrictions that limit harvest, and destroy olive trees. Between 1967 and 2013, Israeli authorities caused $12.3 million in losses annually by uprooting over 800,000 Palestinian olive trees. The impact of that number is hard to grasp, but just imagine it's equivalent to raising all of the 24,000 trees in New York's Central Park 33 times.
This graphic shows how settler violence in the occupied West Bank has been increasing steadily over the years. And often these attacks are supported by the IDF, or the IDF stand by while these attacks take place. The West Bank is divided into 3 zones: Zone A, Zone B and Zone C. Zone A is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. 18% of the West Bank is under Zone A control. Entering Zone A is illegal for Israeli civilians. As you enter into Zone A areas, which includes Bethlehem, you will see signs like this one here on the screen, warning you that this road leads to Palestinian village and the entrance for civilian citizens is considered dangerous. Zone B, Palestinian Authority controls Palestinian public order and civil affairs, and the State of Israel controls the internal security. And Zone B accounts for 22% of the West Bank. And Zone C is under the full control of the State of Israel, and this accounts for 60% of the West Bank. And wherever you go in the West Bank, you encounter checkpoints. The Israeli Defense Force can seal off a Palestinian town or village within a moment's notice. And Jewish settlements in the West Bank are linked by specially built roads that bypass Palestinian towns and villages. Israel's aim is to link these settlements together and create a greater Jerusalem area, as this next map shows. One of the most scarce resources and most important resources in the West Bank is water. Israeli settlers get 5 times more water compared to Palestinians living in the West Bank. On average, an Israeli settler living in the West Bank will gain access to 369 litres of water a day, compared to 73 litres for a Palestinian living in the West Bank. And the water supply to Palestinian areas is controlled by Israel, and Palestinians have very limited access to that water, sometimes for just a couple of days a week. So houses in Palestinian areas have water storage facilities on their roofs, as you can see in this photo. Bethlehem is surrounded by 24 Jewish settlements, which under international law are considered illegal. There are only 7 entries into and out of Bethlehem. All of these are controlled by the Israeli military. Bethlehem is also surrounded by the West Bank security barrier, which Palestinians call the segregation wall or apartheid barrier, and you can see a picture here of the barrier running through Bethlehem. Construction on this wall started in 2002, and when it's completed it will be 440 miles long. Israel says the wall is there to protect its citizens from terrorist attacks, and they would point to the fact that since the wall has been constructed, the number of terrorist attacks in Israel has fallen. Palestinians, however, say that the purpose of this wall is to steal land and control access to natural resources such as water, and to control the movement of the Palestinian people. 15% of the barrier follows the Green Line, which is the border of Israel from 1949 to the Six-Day War in 1967. The remaining 85% of the wall runs as much as 11 miles inside the West Bank, and the wall has isolated 9% of the land and over 25,000 Palestinians from the rest of the Palestinian territory. The wall on the Palestinian side is ugly and grey, whereas the wall on the settler side is landscaped, so it looks much more attractive for the Jewish settlers looking at it. Alongside the wall in Bethlehem is the Waldorf Hotel, which features many pieces of work by the artist Banksy. Here are just some of those artworks that you can see in the Waldorf Hotel. I'm particularly struck by the picture of the nativity scene on the left hand side. This is also another Banksy mural. This is featured not far from where I was staying and shows a protester throwing a bouquet of flowers. In Bethlehem itself there is a refugee camp which dates back from 1948 and houses over 13,000 people in a 1 square kilometre area. In the West Bank there are over 22 refugee camps housing 176,000 refugees. A further 12 refugee camps are found in Gaza with 478,000 refugees, and these camps are run by the United Nations. One of the features of these camps is the many murals that you see around the place. They remind me very much of the murals that you find in places like Belfast. This mural is of a young 14-year-old boy who was shot dead by Israeli Defense Force soldiers earlier this year in Bethlehem. If you're a Palestinian, your freedom to move out of the West Bank is severely restricted, and even within the West Bank, movement can be difficult. Israel operates a permit system to control the movement of people, and there are over 100 different permits in existence. And for Palestinians, getting hold of a permit can be very difficult. For example, I met a number of Palestinians who live in Bethlehem but are unable to get a permit to visit Jerusalem, which is only 7 miles away from Bethlehem. And if you drive a car with a Palestinian number plate, you cannot drive out of the West Bank with that car. Those with Palestinian number plates on their car have to leave their cars at the border before crossing on foot into East Jerusalem or into Israel proper. And these pictures, which are not my own pictures, show what daily life can be like for Palestinians as they go through military checkpoints. And wherever you travel in the West Bank, you encounter checkpoints, and checkpoints make travel very difficult. Journeys that should only take 45 minutes can often take 2 or 3 hours or more because of the heavy traffic and the checkpoints. These next slides show some of the challenges facing Palestinians. The United Nations has accused Israel of establishing an apartheid regime against Palestinians. The UN report said that Israel has established an apartheid regime that dominates the Palestinian people as a whole. There are over 65 laws in Israel today that actively discriminate against Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories. For example, Israel distinguishes between a national and a citizen. To be a national, you must be Jewish. Nationals have more rights than citizens in Israel. Israel's nation-state law, which came into force in 2018, defines Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. The law grants the right to self-determination exclusively to Jews, establishes that immigration leading to automatic citizenship is exclusive to Jews, promotes the building of Jewish settlements and downgrades the status of Arabic from an official language. And in September 2022, Israel introduced a new law saying that foreigners who visit the occupied West Bank must inform Israel's Defense Ministry if they fall in love with a Palestinian. Again, these slides just highlight some of the challenges that Palestinians face. These next slides show the ancient city of Hebron, and Hebron is a good example of the apartheid system in practice. The old city of Hebron is in fact older than the old city of Jerusalem, and this photo is taken in the very heart of Hebron. Palestinians are restricted from accessing many parts of the old city of Hebron because today there are over 750 Jewish settlers living in the old city, defended by a force of over 2,500 Israeli Defense Force soldiers. This is the very centre of Hebron, and just in that picture in the distance you can see a metal barrier halfway down the street. This is as far as Palestinians are allowed to go in the old city. Beyond that, the area is exclusively for the Jewish settlers. As a foreigner with a foreign passport, I was allowed beyond that barrier. And here I am, walking in the Jewish settlement. You can see the Israeli flag with the Star of David flying. You can see a military checkpoint, which is that white little hut, and there is a soldier there, heavily armed. And wherever you go in Israel, you notice very heavy surveillance presence. And in this picture, you can see several security cameras monitoring carefully everything that's happening. And sitting there on the right, and in the middle of the shot, you can see some of the Jewish settlers who now live in this part of Hebron. This street is the ancient heart of Hebron and used to be bustling and full of life until it was closed to Palestinians over 20 years ago. It is now part of the Jewish settlement and Palestinians are no longer allowed along this road. These shops along either side of the road are now bolted shut, but some Palestinian families still live in these properties, but they can no longer access their properties along this main road, but have to access their properties from the rear, often making some difficult journeys to get into their homes. This is a sign right in the very heart of the old city of Hebron, declaring that Hebron has 4,000 years of Jewish history, and this is part of the narrative that you see going on in Hebron today. At the very heart of Hebron is a mosque and synagogue which contains the tomb of Abraham. This is Abraham's tomb, looking at it from the mosque side, and on the other side is the synagogue. The mosque and the synagogue side is protected by a bulletproof glass to prevent anyone from firing from one side through to the other. In the old city of Hebron, you encounter many streets that have been sealed off. This street used to lead to a marketplace, but now leads to the Jewish settlement, so has been sealed, so no one can make their way into the settlement from this side of the city. And this is the old heart of Hebron city, once bustling and full of life. It is now dead. Very few Palestinians risk going into Hebron because it is heavily fortified and often they face harassment as they go in there from soldiers. But also many tourists who once visited Hebron now are no longer going to this very ancient and very important city. This is one of the shopping streets in Hebron, and this wire mesh is there to protect the people walking in the street below. Above this street are Jewish settlers, and they routinely throw their rubbish onto the netting above the street, hence the reason for the netting. This photo is a photo of a lady called Angela Godfrey Goldstein. Angela was born in Britain but has spent much of her life living in Israel. And Angela took us on a tour of East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem, under international law, has been occupied by Israel since the 1967 war. And Israel, since 1967, has been slowly moving for many government offices and departments into East Jerusalem, so that they claim Jerusalem as their city, the whole of their city. The gentleman standing next to Angela is a Palestinian man, a Muslim man, who has lived in East Jerusalem for many years. He extended his family home to accommodate his growing family, but because he didn't get permission from the courts to do this, because permission is impossible to get, his house was confiscated. He has two twins who are now 21 and who are well-known advocates campaigning for Palestinian rights. And earlier this year, they made a TikTok video where his daughter filmed the Jewish settler who now lives in the part of the building that he constructed for his family. And this was released on TikTok and has amassed over 1 million views, as we will now see.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, يا عمي. Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
you are stealing my house. You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it.
This house, opposite the house of the Palestinian gentleman I've just shown you, used to belong to a Palestinian family, but was taken over by Jewish settlers. You can see the Star of David flying from the house, and you can also see the very heavy security presence with all the security cameras. These are not just security cameras from the family that live there, but are fed into the central security hub. This house used to belong to a Palestinian family, but it was forcefully taken from them. Angela, who I showed a picture of just a few moments ago, wrote a report, an article about what happened to the family there, and I just want to read it to you now. This was written and published on the 28th of April 2003. They do it in the middle of the night, on dark nights, quietly, stealthily, in large groups, well-organised militias, armed and all. A crowd of about 50 religious settlers came in the night to two houses in Israeli-annexed Arab East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah over the Green Line. They threw a child out of the broken window they'd entered by, a 2-year-old flying baby falling from the second-storey window, 5 metres high, ending up in hospital traumatised. They hit a man so badly he was driven away unconscious in an ambulance. I saw him go. 3 others also were hospitalised. Blood everywhere, broken doors, broken windows, chains and padlocks they put on gates to stop the neighbours coming to help. They were organised like a small army brigade, and they came even though the court has yet to rule finally on this matter. By the time I arrived, summoned from my sleep by the phone, the baby was in hospital. Thankfully, a resident phoned a diplomat, the police and a peace activist. A small handful of us gathered to witness the aftermath, to learn the truth, to show our support and solidarity. And the police and border police came to help let the settlers, these so-called religious men, go with no arrests, despite the injuries they had inflicted. No arrests, no handcuffs. The police just let them trickle out of the house with their skull caps neatly in place and their sleeping bags stowed neatly in their backpacks. Each one's handgun neatly out of sight. The witnesses later told how every single one of them was armed. We hurled insults at them in Hebrew. They looked amazed and the police verbally abused us instead. They offered police chocolate, these covetous colonials, stood in small clusters chatting with them by the 4 police jeeps as if there had been no crime, no criminal activity. So that is the article that Angela wrote, telling how the Palestinian family's home, the Palestinian family that they used to live there, were evicted from their home by Jewish settlers. Another aspect of life in Israel is the number of Palestinian children who are detained by the State of Israel. Israel is the only country in the world that systematically prosecutes children in military courts. And between 700 to 1,000 children up to the age of 18 are detained by the Israeli army each year, and they can be held from as long as 1 week to over 1 year. And Palestinian children as young as 12 are routinely taken from their homes at gunpoint in nighttime raids by soldiers. When they're taken, they're blindfolded, bound and shackled. They're interrogated without a lawyer or relative being present and with no audio-visual recording. They're routinely put in solitary confinement and forced to sign confessions, often written in Hebrew, a language they do not understand. And often they're held in locations where it is impossible for their families to visit because the families find it difficult to get permits to travel to those areas outside of the West Bank. And these slides just give some interesting and rather shocking statistics about what's happening there. One of the interesting websites to visit if you are interested in finding a little bit more about what's happening in the West Bank is Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence is a website where former soldiers of the Israeli Defense Force share their testimonies about what is really happening in the West Bank. These are soldiers who have been in the West Bank, have seen with their own eyes what's happening to Palestinian people and have been disturbed by it and want to speak out about it and want to highlight what life is like for the Palestinian people. Sadly, the political situation and the security situation in the West Bank is deteriorating, and this year is on course to be the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2005. At the time when I first gave this talk in November, 186 Palestinians, which included 38 children and 28 Israelis, including 1 child, had been killed so far this year. However, sadly, the number of Palestinians since I recorded this has increased. There are deaths on an almost daily basis. The youngest victim killed this year was 1 year old. The oldest that had been killed was 90. The situation facing Palestinians has got more difficult in recent months. Just a short while ago, Israel held elections which saw Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party come back into power, and they have signed a coalition agreement with Jewish Power, which is a far-right party. Its leader, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has been appointed as the National Security Minister. He is very well known for his anti-Arab comments and racism. And he has publicly said that he wants to expel politicians who are deemed disloyal to Israel. This is a reference to Knesset members who represent Palestinian citizens living in Israel, as well as left-leaning Israeli politicians, MPs. So how might we respond to what's happening to the Palestinians today? There are some people who support the BDS movement. This stands for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And the BDS movement is modelled on the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. Some people argue that boycotting those organisations and divesting from organisations and companies that do business with Israel will put pressure on Israel to fulfil its obligations under international law. And the BDS movement wants to see the withdrawal of Israel from occupied territories, the removal of the separation barrier, full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, and respecting and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to be able to return to their homes and properties. As Christians, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to try and be informed about what is happening in Israel and Palestine. And one of the best things I think we can do is to look at the Kairos Palestine document. The picture of the man that you see on your screen in front of you is of Reverend Munther Isaac. He is the Academic Dean of Bethlehem Bible College, and he is one of the authors of the Kairos Palestine document. Kairos Palestine is a Christian Palestinian movement born out of the Kairos document, which advocates for ending the Israeli occupation and achieving a just solution to the conflict. In the document, they write, "Our word is a cry of hope, with love, prayer and faith in God. We address it first of all to ourselves and then to all the churches and Christians in the world, asking them to stand against injustice and apartheid, urging them to work for a just peace. We proclaim our word based on our Christian faith and our sense of Palestinian belonging, a word of faith, hope and love. We declare that the military occupation of Palestinian land constitutes a sin against God and humanity. Any theology that legitimizes the occupation and justifies crimes perpetrated against the Palestinian people lies far from Christian teaching. We urge the international community to stand with the Palestinian people in their struggle against oppression, displacement and apartheid. We demand that all people, political leaders and decision makers put pressure on Israel and take legal measures in order to oblige its government to end its oppression and disregard for international law. We hold a clear position that non-violent resistance to this injustice is a right and duty for all Palestinians, including Christians. We support Palestinian civil society organisations, including NGOs and religious institutions that call on individuals, companies and states to engage in boycotts, divestment and sanctions against the Israeli occupation. Everything that happens in our land, everyone who lives there, all the pains and hopes, all the injustice and all the efforts to stop this injustice are part and parcel of the prayer of the Palestinian Church and the service of all her institutions. So please do take time to look at the Kairos Palestinian document. If you just search for it on Google, you'll quickly find it. And that highlights how the churches in the Palestinian areas, how Christians are responding to what's happening. It highlights some of the injustices that are happening on a daily basis. And as Christians, if we want to respond, if we want to find out what's happening, then I really do commend this document to you. The tragedy is that many Christians have left Palestine, and one of the reasons they've left Palestine is these people tend to be the most highly educated with the means of being able to leave this area, and because of the conditions many Palestinians are facing, many Christians have left Palestine. So today there is a very small population, Christian population, left in the Palestinian territories, which is something that I think should concern all of us as Christians. Finally, a simple and practical thing that you can do that will make a difference to Palestinians is by buying an olive tree. Embrace the Middle East run the Olive Tree Project, where for £15 you can buy an olive tree which will be planted on Palestinian land. This will give the farmer a future income, but also it strengthens their ties to the land and is built on land that would otherwise be at risk of confiscation. When you buy an olive tree, Embrace the Middle East record the location of where that olive tree is planted. So if anything should happen to that olive tree in the future, Embrace and other organisations will know about it. So it's also a way of highlighting and keeping attention on what is happening to the Palestinian people. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I do hope you found it helpful. I thank you for your interest in the Palestinian people, and can I please encourage you to pray for all the people who call the Holy Land home, whether that be Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, or anyone else. I've not talked about political solutions to the problems facing the Palestinian people. I've not touched upon a one-state or two-state solution, and frankly I don't know if that's even possible anymore. But I just encourage you to pray for peace and to pray for the peacemakers. There are many, many people in Israel and in Palestine who want to live lives of peace, and there will never be peace until the problems facing the Palestinian people are tackled. So please do continue to pray for the Holy Land, particularly in the run-up to Christmas. And thank you once again for taking the time to listen to this presentation. God bless you all.